This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
What's that AEW Dynamite show that's coming up soon? Winter is coming. They ain't lying. God, I've already had to break out the scraper, and we're not even in December yet. Some tells me we're in for a rough one this year. Which sucks because I do a lot of driving for my job. But that's why I invest in snow tires each year, because I know I'll need them. Thank you very much, Pittsburgh, for that. Anyway, speaking of cold, miserable experiences. Nah, that one was too easy. That was a layup for me to knock AEW, but I think I should save a lot of that for this upcoming weekend. Because if winter's coming, then let that blizzard roll right in. Couldn't do as much damage to my overall sanity than AEW's done for the last 11 months. Just one slippery downward trickle after another with that program. Now it doesn't even seem like they're trying with these television shows. But if there was ever a show where they were going to need to cram in about 8 last-minute segments to sell a pay-per-view card, Wednesday was the night to do it. What's funny is that after it was over, I still really didn't know a lot of what the card was for Saturday. Poor build. We'll talk about all that shortly, and I do mean short in the literal definition because I had very little to say about that Dynamite program that did not directly involve either cussing or screaming. Moreover, I want to give myself enough time to run down their current card for the full Gear pay-per-view and do some kind of preview analysis before the actual show happens. That way we can find out how much of my predictions actually churn out. Really quick though, make sure you do all the subbing and commenting and liking and all that good stuff. If you're watching on YouTube, specifically, if you're watching on Rumble, you can do the equivalent to what you would normally do if you're watching on YouTube. Today's going to be one of those shows where I just kind of blister through the AEW report, give my expectations for their pay-per-view on Saturday, and then we'll roll right on with the Retro Review series and try to get all this crap uploaded and done before the end of time. Because with the amount of effort I'm getting with these current AEW shows right now, I don't want to give them more time than they deserve. And like I said before, this was supposed to be their go-home show. The show usually designed to hard sell the pay-per-view and try to guarantee some last-minute ticket sales by amping up people's enthusiasm. Well, after this comatose effort from AEW, I'm starting to think they were doing the polar opposite by the time everything was said and done. Especially after I think what might have been the single worst Jon Moxley promo in the history of AEW. And I usually hate his promos because they all end up involving him talking about drinking blood and breaking bones and cooking people's intestines. All he basically did in this promo was stumble through a bunch of crap, look completely disinterested in being there, and also forgetting what day the pay-per-view is taking place, which is always a good sign. So, anyway, let's just get into this fiasco. The opener was a 4-way with Chris Jericho, Sammy Guevara, Bryan Danielson, and Claudio Castagnoli. Sorry, not a 4-way. The 4-way's at the pay-per-view, actually. This was just a standard tag match with the heels and faces. Now, of course, as soon as I heard that they were doing a 4-way for the Ring of Honor World title at the pay-per-view, my first thought was, oh, are they now? How delightful. Yeah, 4-ways. Can't ever get enough of those masturbatory clusterfucks. Now, obviously, I want to save my pay-per-view predictions for later on, but I'll say this from the onset. Have they ever, at any point in the last 2 or 3 weeks, ever made mention of the fact that there was a 4-way at the Full Gear pay-per-view for the Ring of Honor World title with these individuals? Because this is the first time I was hearing about it. I don't really get the logic of booking it to begin with, considering you've got 2 baby faces and 2 heels who are part of the same faction. Now you're pinning them against each other in a 4-way where it's every man for himself. I mean, are they doing this to tease dissension with Jericho's Jagoff Society? Are they doing it to tease dissension in the Blackpool Combat Club with Danielson and Claudio? Because with what I'm going to talk about later on with the main event for the pay-per-view, it kind of makes sense that they would lean in that direction. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Watching this match, I think this was officially the point in my AEW viewing experience where I officially turned on the announcers. It only took me 3 years to get to this point, but I think we've reached that breaking point. God, they were insufferable douchebags during this thing. Seriously, am I crazy? Or were Taz, Tony, and Excalibur spending more time cracking jokes and goofing off during this match than actually calling the action? Normally I just tune them out because they all pretty much suck at their jobs, but goddamn were they annoying during this thing. I already hate that 3-man commentary booth to begin with. I've complained about that numerous times, but listening to these guys goof around for almost the entire first half hour and do virtually nothing to ramp up any kind of excitement for this ROH title match, I mean, they all got heat with me. And not the right kind of heat either. The actual match, God, I don't know. I feel like I say the same things constantly with AEW tag matches at this point. Like, I'm beating a dead horse by going over it again. They all do some moves for a while. There really isn't any kind of heat because the crowd doesn't react to faces and heels the right way anymore. I mean, all they want to see is a bunch of impressive-looking gymnastic stunts. Generally, I'm kind of bored of the whole everybody does back-and-forth shit and no one's really in control. It's just 50-50 back-and-forth stuff and a total chaotic cluster until some dude finally wins flat out of nowhere. And that's pretty much what they did for a finish here. Now, I don't want to spoil anything for my preview predictions later on, but I'm sure everybody that watched this match thought, oh, see, Chris Jericho's not an egomaniac. He's done 2 consecutive TV jobs for Claudio. That means he's not selfish. And I'm sure we're all intended to think that there's a slim possibility that they'd actually be smart enough to have Claudio win that belt back at the pay-per-view, right? Of course, that's not going to fucking happen. We all know where this goes. It is Wrestling Logic 101. Jericho does the 2 consecutive TV jobs so he can turn around and get his win back at the pay-per-view. And anybody that doesn't see that coming a mile away is a tool. Like, there's any way in hell Jericho isn't winning that match on Saturday. But I'll talk about that more in a bit. That was followed with an Anthony Bowen Swerve Strickland match, which was actually preceded with an acclaimed music video drop. Mostly notable for the fact that for the first time in like 8 months, I believe we had a Paul White sighting on TV. Did anyone else completely forget that guy existed? Didn't he actually wrestle on an AEW pay-per-view at one point? Or did I just dream that? It was Full Gear last year, wasn't it? Or am I thinking of another pay-per-view? Maybe it was another one. I don't fucking care. It was a fine little wrestling match once you got past the whole pre-match brawl with Billy Gunn and the fact that they kickstarted a fight on the floor just so they can ring the bell for the start of the match, and then they just immediately went back out to the floor again. Another thing I constantly complain about in modern wrestling that never seems to get addressed. It's just one of those things that apparently we're all just supposed to accept now. I'll talk about the finish in a sec, but, in terms of the character dynamics, this one at least had a clear-cut face and heel. The people love the Acclaimed. Swerve is a good smug douchebag whenever he's not needlessly doing all his regular show-offy, flashy offense. It's one of my general gripes about Swerve and Keith as a tag team. Like the fact that they're both really good cocky pricks, but they never really work their matches like cocky pricks. They just do all their usual crowd-pleasing spots, and they completely lose focus of the fact that they're supposed to be bad guys. I really didn't like the finish, though. They did a heat angle toward the end where Swerve did some kind of move where he essentially snapped Bowens' arm, and, Bowens sold for it great. And at that point, I was thinking, okay, so, maybe they do a deal where Swerve tries to garner some extra heat by grabbing a chair outside the ring to do a DQ finish. That way you don't bury your babyface champions, but, you put them at a disadvantage going into the pay-per-view because now one of the guys has a bum arm 3 days before the title match. So the heels have the upper hand. Simple enough. But no. Instead, Swerve breaks Bowens' arm. Then he hits a double foot stomp for a near fall. And then he just ends up beating Bowens flat with a fucking JML driver. I was like, what the hell was that? Beating one half of your tag champions clean in the middle of the ring before they have to defend their belts on Saturday? Who signed off on that decision, Mr. Booker of the Year, Tony? Like, how's this going to entice people to want to see your pay-per-view when you just beat one of your babyface tag champions clean in the middle of the ring? Who does that? The Acclaim should be protected at all costs right now. They shouldn't be doing jobs to anybody, whether or not it's for a title. So I didn't like that finish at all. It really didn't get me all that excited to see the rubber match. Not that I was really enthused to see it in the first place. Then we had this segment involving the three guys that are apparently competing for one of their 1,800 belts they've got right now. Considering two of the three motherfuckers in this segment have belts right now, it's impossible to keep track of who has what belt. The Samoa Joe Wardlow Powerhouse Hobbs thing. Okay, let me start with the positives. Samoa Joe is the best promo in AEW, maybe outside MJF. No question in my mind. That dude has an impeccable delivery on the microphone, the likes of which you really do not see in the business anymore. It's very few and far between. And I appreciated that for once they actually let Tony Schiavone hold the fucking mic while Joe was doing his heel promo on Wardlow, explaining why he turned on him last week, regardless of how ill-timed and stupid the execution of it was. But Joe was engaging. He let Tony ask his questions. He stood there and snarled and did exactly what you're intended to do in a scenario like this if you actually know what you're doing and if you're good at your job. So that was fine. Now, the pull-apart thing at the end, that was absurd for a wide variety of reasons. The first of which is realizing that people get into brawls in like every segment on this show, so why did this particular segment call for the boys to empty from the locker room to try and separate everybody? Was it literally just a create extra cushion reinforcement on the floor when Wardlow went to do that stupid senton dive over the top rope for no fucking reason? Shit that he is still doing when he has no business doing it? And people apparently still have not told him to cut that shit out? Because that is not what big men are supposed to do in wrestling, regardless of whether or not they can pull it off. That's not the point. Why is Wardlow doing dives? I've been asking this question since pretty much the first time I saw him doing it in his matches as a babyface. And he's still fucking doing it. It's ridiculous. What was even dumber here, though, was the fact that they had the job order all file out to hold back Wardlow. And then literally with about a 15-second time frame, they all just willingly stood around so Wardlow could do the stupid dive. I was like, so you ran out to hold everyone back. Also, you could end up not holding anyone back by the end of the same segment. What a completely useless bit of reinforcement these idiots ended up being. Probably just another lame excuse for Tony to shoehorn them all on television because he refuses to just man up and fire all their talentless asses. So, oh, and by the way, this was their setup to announce 3 days before the pay-per-view, mind you, Samoa Joe versus Powerhouse Hobbs versus Wardlow for the TNT Championship. And I just figured that out now looking back at my notes. A last-minute throwaway title match with someone who used to be the most overact on your roster, now relegated to a three-way title defense with 2 weeks build on television. And we wonder why Wardlow's colder than a witch's tit right now. So, well, very briefly, just wanted to throw in this little tidbit. Britt Baker cut a hell of a pre-tape promo in the back on Saraya, one that I'll be talking about in detail shortly because I have a thing or two to say about it. And I'll actually read you verbatim what I wrote down about it because you'll pick up on what the problem was with it in just a sec. Here's what I wrote. Britt Baker cut a fiery, passionate babyface promo on Saraya, saying that she's the heart and soul of AEW and that she spent the better part of 3 years working her tail off to earn the respect of the fans, including working through the empty arena era of the business when people are living in the darkest of times. And she's not going to let Saraya weasel into AEW and steal her thunder just because Saraya's stuck in the past and still believes the business owes her something when she's long past her point of relevancy. Now, granted, that wasn't a word-by-word description of every line Britt dropped, but that was essentially the gist of it. And, well, yeah. Did you catch the problem there? The fact that I said it was a great, fiery babyface promo? Keyword, babyface? I'm aware AEW doesn't really live in the reality where rivalries and feuds are supposed to have clear-cut villains and heroes, but I'm really finding it hard to justify why anyone would want to cheer for Saraya in this situation when, let's be honest, Britt is not entirely wrong about anything she said in this promo. Or pretty much anything she said about Saraya in the last couple weeks. The fact is, whether or not even Saraya wants to recognize this, Britt's kind of been the heart and soul of the women's locker room in AEW for the better part of 3 years. Granted, it's not much of a milestone because AEW's women's division is utter dreck, and it's been that way since virtually the beginning, but Britt is definitely the standout in that female locker room, at least when it comes to star power, and Saraya is another one of these former WWE rejects that swooped in under everyone's nose and is already trying to stake claims that AEW is her house and that she's owed a bit of gratitude and respect for all of her career accomplishments. So from my vantage point, kind of hard to boo Britt in this scenario. I mean, she's definitely not out of line when she's taking up issue with Saraya trying to walk in and pretend that she's the top face of the division when all she'll probably end up being is another one of Tony Khan's shiny new play toys. You know, until he gets bored with her and loses the plot like he does everybody else. But like I said, it was a damn good promo from Britt. I just wish it came off more heelish in execution instead of being a relatively truthful babyface promo. Because now you're pretty much splitting the audience when it comes to the pay-per-view match. Unless the goal is for Saraya to be heel, and in that case, well, it'd be built up too poorly. Not saying you can't do it, but it really wouldn't make any sense. I don't know. So then they had a trios match, which I didn't even take the time to write anything down about it because I don't care. Like, I'm at the point now where anytime I hear the word trios being uttered in AEW, I immediately tune it out. Because all it ends up circling back to is the Elite in some form or fashion. And surprise, surprise, look what ended up happening at the end of the segment. Now, I'll discuss it more in length when I get to the preview rundown, but yeah, looks like we're going to have to bite the bullet on that one, unfortunately. I probably should have also skipped over this Ethan Page Bandito match. Another one of these AEW World Title Eliminator deals where they never actually explain what a tournament eliminator is or why in the fuck Bandito is in this thing when the only time I believe we've ever seen him on Dynamite is when he did a TV job to Chris Jericho. And for anyone saying, well, he wrestled on Rampage a few times, my response is, yeah. And who's actually watching that piece of shit programming at this point? Exactly. This was a very prototypical AEW indie style match. Lots of choreographed acrobats and flips from Bandito. Lots of guys running past each other. Weird, clunky looking sequence transitioning. Guys kicking out of everything in the book. It looked like something straight out of wrestling school. And I don't think that's the idea we're supposed to get when this is supposed to be the flagship show for a major wrestling company. Air quotes around that. I mean, it was a predictable finish. Like, MJF's winning the world title on Saturday. Like, ain't no way in fucking hell his first title defense is going to be against fucking Bandito. He'd be out of his mind to agree to a match like that. Like, even MJF knows better. Can't say the idea of him and Ethan Page is all that alluring either, but, I mean, it's miles better than the idea of MJF and Bandito. Now, granted, I think Ethan has to wrestle another match at the pay-per-view in order to get that title shot, so we'll see if they even end up getting to that point. I think the match they're doing on Rampage is Ricky Starks and Lance Archer, which seems like Ricky's match to win there. So if it ends up being Starks and Page at the pay-per-view with Starks going over, I mean, I'll be happy with that outcome. I mean, I can tolerate Page getting the first title shot, although I don't like the idea of it because it probably would mean that MJF would go into that match as the babyface. As I mentioned before, babyface MJF is the ultimate nail in the coffin for his career. So hopefully that's not the plan. There was the typical girls match and most people probably skipped over, myself included. I'll talk about the actual match I have booked for the card in a bit. But that took us to the final segment, the face-off between Jon Moxley and MJF ahead of the title match. And remember earlier on when I was talking about how this might have been the single worst Moxley promo of all time? Well, I don't think I'm all that far off in my opinion on that. I don't know where his brain was during this promo, but he was all over the place trying to get this thing out. Stumbling over his words, mumbling through sentences, sounding like he was just completely uninterested in being there. I have no idea what the hell happened here, but this was just bad. And that wasn't even the worst part of it, because after he basically sells everybody on the fact that he doesn't see MJF as a threat in beating him at the pay-per-view, out come The Firm to try and attack Moxley. Again, why they feel the need to keep trying to force this faction down our throats when no one could possibly care at this point is beyond me. They're not over. Nobody cares about The Firm, and they never did. And when they ran out to attack Moxley here, you could literally hear the active groan response from the crowd. Like, oh my God, not this garbage again. And of course, they're all stumping a mud hole in Mox, which evidently gets the people to start an MJF chant, because that's exactly what you want to do with a character like MJF, is give the people more incentive to want to cheer for him every week, even though it is the polar opposite of what got him over in the first place. But eventually he runs down. He clears house of all the Firm dorks in very John Cena-like fashion. The crowd honestly does not know how to respond to that either, because they start to realize, hey, wait a minute. That is not something the MJF character would really ever do, so this doesn't really make a lot of sense. So they're all kind of sitting on their hands while MJF is disposing of the heels. And then he basically has to start flailing his hands in the air just to try and bring some life and energy to the segment. Elsewise, I think everyone would have probably fallen asleep, myself included. And at that point, while Mox is selling on the floor, clutching his jaw, MJF starts to do a promo on him, saying he needs the AEW World Championship more than water and oxygen. And while he's trying to get over his catchphrases at the end, Mox stands up and grabs the mic from MJF. And he basically does a popcorn fart closer to his promo by telling Max that we'll see if he has the guts to finally break out as the top guy come full gear. That is, if Moxley doesn't eat them first, which I'm sure he alluded to in this promo at some point. Probably wanted to drink his fluids too, because That's what Moxley apparently gets off on. This was, to coin a phrase from the Book of Maxwell, this was very mid. And of course, the whole thing is entirely made better by the fact that the goddamn Valvoline associate couldn't remember whether or not the pay-per-view was on Saturday or Sunday. Fucking moron, seriously. God, and I hate to say it, but even for an MJF promo, I mean, he had some fire here, and I genuinely believe the words he said when he said that he needed the AEW world title more than anything else in the world. I just don't like them even teasing the idea of MJF as a babyface. Even if the whole thing ends up being an elaborate work where they end up swerving everybody by the end, which I'm sure is the game plan, but you see how even the thought of MJF as a babyface is a bad idea on paper? It completely shifts the dynamics of his personality, and not in a good way. And I've got to admit, it hasn't made his segments all that enjoyable. Excluding that one promo exchange he had with Regal on television a few weeks ago that was just really phenomenal. But even in that instance, it was MJF still being MJF. You know, he wasn't running out to send the heels packing or try to fire up the crowd with babyface mannerisms. Everything he did in this segment just felt unnatural. Discounting the promo. The run-off with the firm, I just didn't believe it. It didn't come across to me as authentic. I don't know. You know, this whole feud really hasn't done it for me. And I pretty much assumed that was going to be the case when the whole CM Punk situation went down. You know, I said even before they put the belt back on Mox that him and MJF in a short-term program probably wasn't going to do a whole lot for me. I don't like Moxley's ring style, so there was always going to be that clash in that aspect. But I did note, if the end goal was to get the belt on MJF, I could put up with several weeks of blasé programming just to get to that point. It's not been MJF's best work this year, but as I'll talk about in a minute with the preview predictions part, if they end up going in the direction that I'm expecting them to go, I think it'll be good for all parties involved. You know, and I guess while we're on the subject, we may as well get into it right now by running down the full gear card. Talk about what I think is going to happen in these matches and my overall excitement level for anything that's going down, as if you already can't tell. And specifically when it comes to this MJF Jon Moxley world title match. I think you only have one suitable option. You've got to have MJF win that world title. I think that's a given at this stage. The timing is right for them to do it, and while it's not coming against the ideal opponent, I think we all know the original plan was to have MJF beat CM Punk for them to kind of wrap up that whole feud they started in the spring of this year before that all got fucked up. But at the end of the day, you're still arriving at the same point with Max where you need to strike while the iron is hot. Moxley has been a fine placeholder champion, but MJF is the hotter act right now. There's an inbuilt story with him finally getting his big moment, and this is just one of those can't-miss circumstances. You do not have a second option when it comes to booking this finish. MJF has to go over, and he has to win that title. Now, how he does it? That's a different matter entirely. And for me, that's where the pieces to this puzzle start to come together after everything they've been teasing on the television show. Again, I don't like the idea of a babyface MJF as the champion. I don't think it works. I don't think it fits the character. It completely retcons almost his entire backstory if they just have MJF defy the odds and win clean because he's capable of doing so. Like, nobody wants to see a white meat babyface MJF, especially if he's probably going to be holding on to that belt for a long time. They've laid a lot of groundwork for potential swerves, and I think that the best option they have right now to capitalize on the momentum of that promo face-off with Regal weeks back, when the chips are down and MJF finds himself in dire need of needing to cheat to get that big win, that's when you have Regal feed him the diamond ring. And it's not just MJF staying heel, but it's also flipping Regal from his Blackpool Combat members to join forces with MJF. It works. I think it's a much better role for Regal going forward on the program, and let's be honest, nobody cares about the Blackpool Combat Club. It's another faction that hasn't been a damn thing since they launched it. Nobody in that group is really affiliating with one another at this point. Flatwheel Yuta has completely vanished from the television show after teasing dissension with Danielson a few weeks back. Claudio's just kind of a lingerer at this point, and Moxley really hasn't done anything with the group since the War Games match months back. So it's obvious that group is going to eventually split, and I think Regal turning on Mox and siding with MJF can be the catalyst to that. It gives them more of an opportunity to develop their story of Max holding Tony hostage for more money once his contract comes due in 2024. You can keep the belt on MJF long term and have him continue to be his natural self. You don't have to keep leaving the fans hanging, wondering whether or not MJF found God and realized the better road to happiness. He's already gimmicked himself the devil, so now you have to embrace that. Whether or not the people cheer him, that doesn't matter because you're always going to have a subset of the people that cheer for him anyway. It's the presentation of him, or it's the presentation of him on the television show that matters. And I can promise you, you're always going to get more mileage out of MJF being himself rather than portraying a babyface persona that comes off very forced and very contrived. No matter how much Chris Jericho tries to persuade him that it's the right way to go, Chris Jericho's opinion means absolutely nothing, especially after everything he's been involved with for the better part of 2 years. I still maintain that he almost single-handedly killed MJF's career with that program 2 years ago, so Jericho is completely irrelevant in this conversation. For MJF, this is all about the execution of the finish. You can go the route of having him win clean without the ring, doing it on his own for the first time in his career, blah, blah. But what's going to get more mileage in the long run? That is the question that Tony ought to be asking himself as a promoter and a businessman. I think the former option's better, but we'll see what he decides on. I don't expect the match to be any good because it'll probably end up being a Jon Moxley match, and those are always terrible matches. But if the finish is the right call, I can probably overlook the particulars of the actual match. So with that said, since the main event is the only thing I'm particularly looking forward to on the card, I guess we can kind of blast through the remainder of this thing in pretty quick succession. I'll just start from the top of the wiki page and work my way down. I suspect this won't be the actual card structure, but it looks like this is an official full card. It looks a lot less busy than previous events. So maybe Tony finally learned his lesson about, trying to stretch out pay-per-views to 4 hours with 15 matches. So at least we have that going. I'll probably be able to get to bed before fucking dawn. The Acclaim versus Swerve in Our Glory tag title match, it'll probably be good. I personally haven't been all that high on Keith and Swerve as a tag team, and they've been teasing the split between them for so long now. If it doesn't happen at the pay-per-view, then I don't know what they're prolonging at this point, especially when everybody sees it coming a mile and a half away. Bowens and Caster are obviously not losing the titles. I think this will be one of those unfortunate circumstances where the first match they had at the All Out show was so damn good because nobody was expecting that it was going to be that good in the first place. And then they try to top that with the chemistry of the TV rematch, and it didn't really reach that level. I don't see this being any different. It'll probably be good, but factoring in that they beat Bowens on the go-home show clean in the middle of the ring, again, my excitement level for the rubber match really isn't all that high right now. The Acclaimed obviously have something going for them right now as a tag team. They're white hot with the AEW crowd. I'm sure it'll eventually die out because Tony has no idea how to capitalize on anybody's momentum that occurs organically. See Wardlow, see FTR, see Ricky Starks, see Bryan Danielson, see Miro. See any list of guys in the last 3 years that could have been bigger deals if Tony would have stuck the course with them. Speaking of FTR, I'd love to know why they're sitting this show out when they're the best tag team in AEW, other than the fact that you got the Beta Bucks in Tony's ear telling him to de-emphasize FTR because their fragile little egos can't stand the fact that Cash and Dax are more over than they are. We'll get to them in a minute. Tony Storm and Jamie Hayter for the women's title. If it doesn't end up being my piss break for the night, it'll probably end up being something that I have on in the background. Nothing against either girl personally. I know people are kind of behind Jamie Hayter right now. Yeah. I mean, truthfully, I haven't been paying close enough attention to the girls' division in AEW to catch wind of how over Jamie is at this point. Obviously, she's another case where they've been teasing a split with her and Britt Baker for fucking eons now, and it's never really gone anywhere. They just keep putting it off. Could they put the belt on Jamie? Maybe. But aren't they still trying to eventually do Thunder Rosa and Toni Storm when Rosa finally comes back from her injury? At least I thought that was the end goal, and we all know Tony doesn't like to change his plans. I don't know. Tony's another oddball case for me. Everyone used to talk about how great she was in WWE, and I never saw it. She has a unique look, but was she ever on the same level of someone like a Bianca or a Rhea or a Becky? Not that I ever saw. I mean, her run as interim champion hasn't really lit the world on fire, so what does that tell you? Like I said, this will probably be my pit stop point in the show because I'll probably need one at some point. The four-way deal with Chris Jericho, Bryan Danielson, Claudio Castagnoli, and Sammy Guevara for the ROH title. Again, I talked about this earlier in the Dynamite report. I have no clue where the hell this match came from or why it was booked. Two baby faces and two heels in opposing factions, but you're pitting them all against each other in a four-way. Talk about the epitome of lazy booking. I still would like to get one of those corny t-shirts, although it'll probably still be too big because everyone's fucking fat anymore, so chances of Corny's brand selling a small size for guys like me, highly unlikely. But boy howdy, those quadruple XLs will sell like lottery tickets. Hit the gym, folks. Ain't no shame. Anyhow, I really don't give a fuck who wins this match, if I'm being honest. We all know Jericho's gonna win. I mean, that's not even a question. The whole Ring of Honor thing is such a dead enterprise to me at this point. They had a chance to get me excited about it, but here we sit in November of 2022, months after the buyout, and it's still just a product that exists by name only. No one cares about it. All it does is clutter up the AEW television show with more bodies and more belts. If they ever decide to settle on a network deal in 2023, maybe I'll be open-minded to it. But for where we are right now, it's just another match on the AEW show for a belt that means absolutely nothing. And sorry, yes, just because Chris Jericho holds the belt right now doesn't make it any more prestigious. Just like the TBS Championship, which is another belt that has absolutely no value. Especially when the champion Jade Cargill is defending against Nyla Rose. Yeah, that is where we are with AEW's women's division in 2022. Jade Cargill and Nyla Rose are going to have a live pay-per-view match. And they want us to pay for that. It'd be better served on the pre-show. Or maybe a better fit on AEW Dark, so none of us have to see it. Unfortunately, we all probably will. Then we have the controversial girls match for the pay-per-view. Saraya versus Britt Baker, who have actually had a handful of good exchanges on television. And even if the promo material hasn't been bad, and even if there is mild curiosity in seeing Saraya back in the ring again after all that time off, all I'm going to do is pose a very simple question that I want every single one of you to ponder. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. I'm just asking. Look, I'm not going to sit here and imply that Britt Baker and Saraya as an attraction match is a bad idea. By far, it's probably one of the bigger AEW matches they can do for their girls division. When it comes to name value, when it comes to main event attractions, Britt and Saraya are pretty high on the pecking order. Probably about as high as you can get on the pecking order. And we all know how critical I am of AEW's women's division. Britt is obviously their biggest female star. She's been on top for well over 2 years now, but Saraya's somebody with name value. Yes, she is a former WWE name, but somebody that also has some appeal if you're a former WWE fan that knew about her history of injuries. And if you're reading the news and you catch wind that she's in AEW now and that she's medically cleared to wrestle after years of not being in the ring, I can see how you might get excited about the idea of wanting to watch her in the ring again. Can she still go? How will she be? What will she actually do in the match with Britt after almost 5 years out of the ring? I get it. There's some high stakes here. But at the same time, as a business owner, you have to do something called risk analysis. There's an old catchphrase out there. Maybe some of you have heard it before. The juice ain't worth the squeeze. And when you factor in injuries, the early retirement, the fact that she's been away for so long, you tie that in with Britt's history of injuries, the broken nose, the broken wrist, some of the reckless stuff she's done in her matches over time. At what point do you do a deeper analysis and think, maybe this isn't such a good idea? Again, risk assessment. Is it worth going down that rabbit hole when there's a chance something could go horribly wrong? Even if it doesn't. I'm not saying that it's highly likely or even probable. But is it possible? And for Saraya's health in particular, what do you really get out of the whole thing if something were to go wrong? I still have a lot of questions about that, by the way. Her being, quote, medically cleared to compete. Oh, has she been training? Has she been actively taking bumps? Like, how bad is her ring rust? Is she constantly being monitored? Or are they just throwing caution to the wind and they're going to throw her out there cold and hope for the best? I don't know. I don't like their odds right now, especially with the environment of AEW matches where everyone does stupid shit and reckless stuff all the time. I'm worried this will end up turning into one of those situations because they're going to want to try stuff. Saraya's probably going to take some risks here, whether or not it's a good idea to do so, but she's probably going to try. The problem too with Britt is that she's never really been famed for being a particularly great ring general. She's a good promo, but as a worker, she's been pretty hit and miss throughout her career. Is she going to be able to carry Saraya here? Who's going to be leading the match? What's the story they're going to tell? Like I pointed out in the Dynamite review, I'm still not even sure who the babyface and the heel in this thing is. Especially not after Britt's promo on the Go Home episode. This is going to be one of those nail-biter viewing experiences. There's a chance it could go one of two ways. It'll either be pleasantly good, or it could turn out to go in the polar opposite direction and end up being a tragedy in the end. And judging AEW's luck for most of this year, can you see why I'm a bit skeptical? I'll watch. I presume Saraya has to go over, provided some outstanding circumstance where they have to call an audible. But Saraya's debut match for AEW, her first match back in well over 5 years, give or take. I mean, I don't see how you don't put her over. What it leads to afterwards is another matter entirely, but this is definitely one of those more intriguing matches they've got booked for the card right now. For better or worse, we'll find out eventually. We also have this Jeff Jarrett, Jay Lethal versus Sting Darby Allin match, which I don't even really know where to begin to comment with this one. The whole Jeff Jarrett thing, I've already talked about that pretty extensively. He's already starting to eat up more screen time than I think what should be allotted to him. And I didn't even discuss his backstage deal on the past Dynamite show, but yes, he was there. I mean, the one thing I'll credit Jeff for, he's a good worker. And him being in there with Darby, Sting, and Lethal, I don't expect the match to be bad by any means. The booking is another matter entirely. I think as a one-and-done ordeal where they put Jeff out there to try to pop a couple pay-per-view buys by pairing him with Sting, maybe for the nostalgia factor, it'll probably get a decent reaction. But in no way, shape, or form should Jeff be going over in that match. If he winds up pinning either Darby or Sting, I'm going to have some problems with it. I think 100% they need to put Sting and Darby over here. Even if I'm not all that big on Darby, and I never have been, him and Sting have been a good pairing. The people like them. Nobody gives a shit about Lethal's group at this point, and that includes Sanjay and Satnam. This will be another case where I'm mostly just kind of watching for the finish. You know, the baby faces should ideally go over, and hopefully that it directly involves Jarrett doing the job. Although with him, I never give my hopes up. Not after watching his reign of terror in WCW and TNA for the better part of 20 years. It was a time that I would like to forget ever existed in the wrestling business, and I think for a lot of AEW fans, especially the ones that stuck around for that TNA period during the early to mid-2000s, I am not alone in that. As far as the Luchasaurus Jungle Boy Jack Perry cage match, this is sort of a two-parter. One, why the fuck are they having a cage match? Aside from the fact that they just felt the need to do one. More importantly, though, I've really been over this whole Jurassic Express story pretty much since they butchered the whole Christian Jungle Boy material on television, and that was months ago at this point. What could have been, and what ended up turning out into being such a dud by the end. Not just taking into account Christian's injury, but just Jungle Boy's whole lackadaisical approach to this whole feud. His promos have been lousy. His engagement with the dinosaur has been blasé. Generally, I think they've just dragged this on for way too long. You know, and with Christian still being out of action, I don't understand why they feel the need to keep dwelling on it. Why not just wait for the guy to get healed and return to TV? What I'd rather see is Jungle Boy go on and do something else until Christian's ready to come back. And then if they feel the need, they can dive back into the program. But now it just seems like they're prolonging it for the sake of prolonging it. And I don't get anything out of the dinosaur at this point. The boat has long since sailed on that guy. And sorry to say, but even Jungle Boy is kind of reaching that territory with me. I don't think the build to the cage match has been done all that well. I didn't even know they were having a fucking cage match until I saw them throw the graphic up on screen for it. I mean, they probably just announced it on Rampage and went into Dynamite assuming everybody knew it was booked. All 72 people that are still watching Rampage. So, yeah, I don't really expect this to be any good. Who should go over? I don't care. Probably Jungle Boy, but if the dinosaur wins, I won't lose sleep over it either. And that brings us to the trios match, which I'm actually now finding myself at a bit of a crossroads. I need your input. Do I watch it? Do I not watch it? I know I'll hate it, because it's a Young Bucks Kenny Omega trios match, and they're wrestling Death Triangle, who are just as bad when it comes to constructing logical, coherent wrestling matches with a bunch of them. I have absolutely no expectations of enjoying the match, but I'll tell you what I'm interested in. I want to find out how the fans react to this. Chime in and let me know. You think they start a CM Punk chant? Or at least try to? I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities. I think there's a lot of hidden dissension with some of these AEW fans when it comes to the whole Elite CM Punk dynamic. I mean, yeah, there's always going to be that subset of people that love the Elite, but there are some CM Punk fans that are still lingering in that AEW audience. Hasn't been all that present on television, but under the right circumstance, if there was ever a time to start the CM Punk chant, this would be it. You know, I've obviously vented about the whole investigation fallout. It's an unfortunate situation, purely prostrated by the three insufferable douchebags in this match that couldn't handle the fact that there was a bigger star that outshined them on every level in the last year. I mean, we read the reports. You know, you knew they were always looking for an excuse to can CM Punk as soon as they signed him. Now they get their chance to come back and live their fantasy of what they all envision wrestling to be. A bunch of backyard trampoline stunts and routines where everyone's cooperatively taking part in exposing the business and making it look phony in Bush League. These guys are the masters of it. They've done an incredibly great job in suckering in dumbasses like Dave Meltzer to think that this is what wrestling is supposed to be. An all-inclusive masturbatory jerk-off session of moves. But I am going to watch this purely to see how the fans take to it. There will probably be a good chunk of them that'll all cheer for the Elite and wow at all the incredible spectacles, no matter how phony and choreographed they look. But I am really wondering about that vocal minority of the fan base. The people that actively try and start a CM Punk chant. And can they get enough people to rally behind it so that it actually detracts from the match? Because that'll surely send a message to Tony Khan. That'll let him know how stupid of a decision it was to let him go. Especially if he winds up in WWE in 2023. Not saying it'll happen for sure, but if it does, you just wait. I expect the Elite to go over and win their belts back. I mean, that's why the belts are created to begin with. To give Omega and the Bucks an outing so they can isolate themselves from the actual talent on the roster. Also, they can play in their own little corner with all their indie rejects that nobody wants to see. And they'll be back on TV doing all their dorky Cutler Cam segments and cringy pre-tapes so they're acting like schoolchildren. And for the subset of weirdos that actually like that kind of stuff, they can rub one out. Me, on the other hand, I'll just get up and go to the bathroom or something during their segments. Speaking of bathroom breaks, I may need to take another one at some point on this show. And I can't think of a better time to go than this 3-way TNT title match they've got booked. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, but I thought you said you liked Wardlow, Samoa Joe, and Powerhouse Hobbs. And you're right. I do. I like all three of these guys individually. I never said I had any interest in seeing them do a 3-way against one another, especially with approximately 2 weeks of TV build, especially when the Samoa Joe heel turn came right the fuck out of nowhere with no incentive. And at this point, I still have no idea how Hobbs got thrust into this thing. I mean, he was just there with no rhyme or reason. But the real story, Wardlow, man. I can't believe how badly they've dropped the ball with him in the last several months. All that momentum, all that build, all that investment they put into his character with that MJF program. And now he's in a complete throwaway match on a pay-per-view against two guys who've both meant nothing on this show. I mean, Joe's been a non-factor since he debuted, and even Hobbs. He was another guy that was poorly capitalized on after that feud with him and Starks that went nowhere. Looks like that program's been dropped entirely, and Starks is off doing something else now. Hobbs is probably in this match just so he can take the fall. Yeah, great follow-up for him. Wardlow should obviously win, but God. You look at where he is now compared to where he was back in even May, or even earlier when they were first building to the babyface turn. Did you ever think we would come to this point? Now he's just spinning his wheels on the roster like everybody else. You know, and the fact that he's a TNT champion, it means nothing at this stage, because that belt hasn't meant jack shit in forever. Mostly thanks to all the hot potato title changes we've seen in the last year plus. So there's that match. You know, they also have this pre-show match listed here with Ricky Starks and Lance Archer in the tournament eliminator. Kind of alluded to it earlier, but I suspect Starks is to go over in that match. That'll probably set up him and Ethan Page for Dynamite, and then hopefully Starks goes on to win that, because him and MJF for the world title actually would be a great match. And for a first title defense, too, I can't think of a better dance partner for Max to work with than a babyface Starks. So that I'm actually kind of looking forward to. So there you have it. That is AEW's Full Gear lineup as of now. I hope that's the full card, but Lord only knows. Tony might try to stack on another 4 or 5 matches because he'd love to see that show go until 2 a.m. I noted this before. I'm going to reiterate this again. I am purely watching this show for the main event. Everything else that happens is pretty much filler as far as I'm concerned. The show has been built up to very poorly, so why would I really invest in anything outside the MJF match? And really, that's just more to see Max win the world title, because I really could care less about the actual match. Feel free to let me know what you think of all this. Or let me know what your expectations are for the show. Am I being too harsh? Maybe. But I'm just judging it based on how mediocre these Dynamite shows have been since the Brawl Out incident. AEW's been in a real stagnation period for a long time now, and them losing CM Punk has only added fuel to the fire. I don't really like the current creative direction AEW's been going for a long time now. They've really dropped the ball with a lot of their key players recently. They have a chance to rectify it going forward by putting MJF over and having him win the belt. But again, it's got to be done the right way. He's got to stay heel. He's got to stay champion for a while. And I mean like well into 2023. Maybe even approaching the end of his contract deal in 2024 if they actually want to go that direction. I mean, it's a long way off from now, but MJF is somebody that you can trust to stay healthy long enough where you can actually invest in a story like that and not have it go sideways. So MJF is really my only hope for All Elite Wrestling right now. Hopefully, if anything else, the main event doesn't disappoint. So on to the classic content. NWA World Championship Wrestling, November 15th, 1986. Cold open for this week was a 30-second clip of the Midnights jumping Ronnie Garvin after a match on NWA Pro, which came completely out of left field, considering I don't even remember the last time I saw Ronnie Garvin on this program. And he definitely wasn't doing much with the Midnight Express in terms of on-screen feuding. But, well, considering we've already got the scaffold match booked with the Midnights and the Road Warriors, it's pretty obvious what they were setting up here, and we will talk about that in a minute. First, we go to Tony Schiavone and David Crockett, where Tony proceeds to do a rapid-fire rundown of pretty much the entire Starrcade card. All the while, you got Big Bubba and Jim Cornette standing in the background being wacky. And by that, I entirely mean Jim Cornette, because Bubba really never did anything except stoically stand in the background. But when Tony gets to the Night of the Skywalkers match, that is when he turns things over to Corny, who basically vowed that it would be the final night we would ever see Hawk or Animal wrestle, because the Midnights are going to end their careers for good. He also promoted the Bobby Eaton-Dennis Condrey workout session that we would see later on in the show. And boy, we will get to that in due time. But we went to the ring for another six-man squash featuring Bobby Dennis and Bubba, going up against Lee Peak, Alan West, and Vernon Deaton. I think this might have been a case where they were getting ready to tape, and someone said, "Who are the worst set of job guys we've got hanging around in the locker room right now? Lee Peak, Alan West, Vernon Deaton, come on down." And they basically sent these poor jabronis out there to get massacred. And that they did. I like during the match, Cornette is mentioning all the people he was talking to overseas that were in agreement that the scaffold match is the most dangerous match in all of professional wrestling, saying he's talked to men from Japan, England, and, of all places, Bolivia. If Cornette actually knows anybody from Bolivia, I will personally send him $100 of my own money. The only other subtle thing I wrote down about this match, God bless Bubba. I always liked Bubba Rogers, always thought he was a talented worker, but it was no secret that he was greener than goose shit at this stage of his career. I mean, he was literally, I think a year or so into his career by this point. He tagged in for the first time in this match and proceeded to royally fuck up the first 3 moves. And in fact, his only 3 moves, wherein he whiffed a boot to one of the job guys and caught him flesh on the shoulder, Then he followed that with an elbow coming off the ropes where he was totally out of place for it. And then he proceeded to give one of the guys a Samoan drop where he almost landed directly on the guy's shoulder coming down. Not the best Bubba showcase I've ever seen. And to think that he's about to wrestle Ronnie Garvin in like 2 weeks on the Starrcade event. Also enjoyed Bobby Eaton getting the pin by putting his pinky finger on the guy's chest. Then we went to a ravishing Rick Rude promo, talking about his upcoming Indian strap match with Wahoo McDaniel, or as Rude refers to him as, Squahoo McDaniel. And he's basically talking about how even though the strap match is Wahoo's kind of match, Rude has the youth, the strength, and the endurance to beat Wahoo. He also promised that the Paul Jones Army was going to shave Big Mama after Valiant loses his hair match. We'll see about that one, good sir. I did like at the end his final line, "We're going to celebrate Thanksgiving Day the ravishing way." Very underrated comment. But then we go to the studio with Tony Schiavone for a Starrcade update. More importantly, the midnight workout on the scaffolding, which might have been the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life. It was definitely the peak of this particular episode. It begins with Corny and the Midnights in the ring, with a giant scaffold structure hanging above the ring. And this is genius with the way they filmed it, because I think we were supposed to get the impression that Corny is trying to calm Eaton and Condrey down before the cameras were set to film this promo segment, just to kind of show that they aren't afraid of heights. But then the reality is that Eaton and Condrey are clearly afraid of heights with the way they were setting all this up. And Cornette starts his promo off by saying, "In order to get your boys in training and ready to work the scaffold match, first, you have your mother buy a scaffold so they can erect it and get the film crew to come down." Because Corny did what every red-blooded American would do when they are faced with a crisis situation. He called his mother. Fucking lost at that line. This was also probably my favorite Bobby Eaton segment of all time, because Corny's trying to sell that his men are not afraid of heights, and while he's trying to get Eaton to climb the structure so that they can demonstrate their workout routine, Eaton just goes, "But Corny, I'm scared." And there's Cornette giving him a kiss on the cheek, telling him to be a big boy and climb the scaffolding for the good people. God, these men were great. And for the next minute and a half, you got Eaton and Condrey trying to weasel their way from having to climb this gimmick. Meanwhile, you got Cornette actively getting more and more frustrated, going, "You're making me look like an idiot in front of all these people. Climb." But here's the thing you have to keep in mind. For those of you that have never seen these tapes before, the whole time Condrey and Eaton are climbing this thing, you can actively see the structure begin to wobble and shake, because it is literally these thin-ass rails that are all braced together in this really janky manner. This is not what you would call a sturdy mechanism. And I think Corny's even talked about it before on his podcast, how Bobby Eaton was deathly afraid of heights. So imagine what he's thinking at this point. Probably shitting himself when he realizes how unstable this fucking contraption is. And all the while, I'm watching this thing go down, and my heart is racing the entire time I'm watching this, because I am literally watching Eaton and Condrey walking across a giant grating while the whole structure is jerking back and forth. And at the point Eaton loses his balance and just lays stomach first across the middle of the platform, I just couldn't stop laughing. Obviously you look at it in 2022 and realize, well, they obviously survived this thing. No one died, so I can have a good laugh at the absurdity of the whole thing. If I had not known any better, and I had never seen this before, and I had no idea what actually went down in that scaffold match at Starrcade, I would have been peeing myself the entire time this thing went down, just out of pure fear. And I'm not even afraid of heights. I just, wouldn't want to see anybody die. And then, of course, it's great because fucking Big Bubba, of all people, he just starts effortlessly climbing the thing in no time. just casually walking across the platform like it's an everyday stroll in the park. But this gets better because then Corny starts to climb the thing, and they got the camera on him while he's wincing and monkey gripping the sides of the scaffold because he obviously doesn't want to climb it. But now we have our selling point for the scaffold match. The heels are cowardly chicken shits that are afraid of heights, and the Road Warriors are going to have an easy time plowing right through these mofos. It's a pretty great selling point if you ask me. God, I love this segment. I went back and rewatched it over and over again, purely for the comedy of watching Eaton and Condrey literally see their life flash before their eyes while they're on top of that thing. Like, you know for a fact, Bobby Eaton being scared to climb this thing was a fucking shoot. He was not faking that fear. No way. Then we came back from the break for a Superstar Bill Dundee promo, promoting the Central States Heavyweight Championship tournament that he is apparently going to be competing in. All right, then. Another completely random addition to the Starrcade card that I completely forgot about. Also mentioned here that he was going to be wrestling Sam Houston, which he set up by inferring that he does not like rednecks and he doesn't even own a pickup truck. To which his next sentence was, "And that's exactly what you are, Sam Houston." To which I said, "What, a pickup truck?" And, well, I think I gathered from this promo that Bill Dundee really doesn't like rednecks. That's what I got out of it. He was also very confident that he was going to be the next Central States Heavyweight Champion. Then we had Tim Horner and Ricky Lee Jones versus the Mulkey Brothers, which David Crockett set up by saying, this is a direct quote, "It's Mulkey Mania." Sometimes I just can't with David. Sometimes he says things that are so absurdly hysterical, you can't even dignify it with words. Mulkey Mania. If only. Anyway, they wrestled for a few minutes. Horner pretty much took the entire match for his team. And then finally, Ricky Lee tagged in at the end and went over with a cool-looking spinning toe hold pin that, if I'm not mistaken, I think Darby Allin uses that same move in AEW. I forget what he calls it. The Last Supper? Can't remember. But Ricky Lee Jones used it here. So maybe Darby was watching his NWA tapes when he came up with that finish. And even with Bill and Randy wearing two different colored tights for this match, I still had no idea which one was which. Then we came back for a Ric Flair promo, who proceeded to give us a great educational lesson in how to spend your average American dollar, beginning with a $35,000 ring, followed by a $15,000 watch, followed by a $2,200 custom suit. So in its simplest terms, in order to be a successful American, you have to be rich. I mean, I can't argue with that logic. Financial freedom. It's probably the only thing that guarantees your ability to make your own decisions without government interjection. Ric Flair figured it out. And somehow he was able to tie this all in with Nikita Koloff, saying that even though Nikita's got the backing support of the American people and currently riding the luxury lifestyle, he's also getting soft, calling him Dusty Rhodes' stooge. And he basically infers that Nikita cannot handle the Nature Boy come Starrcade. Only Flair could somehow tie all that together by the end, still getting the plugs in for his accessories. Then we went to the ring for Tully Blanchard and Keith Patterson. Tully beat him with the slingshot suplex in about a minute. Then we came back to Tully and JJ after the break for a promo at the booth, making their early predictions that the Four Horsemen could walk away with all the gold by the time Starrcade's over. But when it comes to the first blood match between Tully and Dusty for the TV title, the Horsemen's mission of breaking hands and breaking legs is not sufficient enough, because they've got to make Dusty bleed in order to guarantee victory. And, Tully sort of restated the first talking point of the promo here, vowing that the Horsemen were leaving Starrcade with all the gold. Really nothing much else to say about it. Brad Armstrong then wrestled Tony Zane. They also wrestled for about a minute before Brad went over with the Russian leg sweep. I can also confirm that Tony Zane had bruises in a lot of different locations on his body from the last time we saw him. I wonder if that guy ever went to a doctor about that. Maybe get some blood work done to figure out why he bruised so easily. Could have been a nutritional deficiency, but I don't think enough research was ever done on Tony Zane to confirm that one way or the other. I'll tell you who didn't bruise easily, though, was the Russian Nightmare, Nikita Koloff. And boy, was that man fired up for this promo. Ric Flair was talking trash on him, and now Nikita's pissed. Out there flexing and showing his massive arms while Flair's saying that Nikita's soft. And after Nikita drops Flair with the Russian sickle, he's going to stand over him and ask him, "How soft does that feel, Ric Flair?" And you know for a fact this promo made Dusty proud, because after Nikita delivers his Dynamite speech, there's Dusty standing next to him with that proud dad smile. Like he knows his son just fucking nailed it, and he couldn't be happier for him. So, well, he basically didn't have anything to say, so he just hyped up Starrcade, promising that the superpowers were going to take it all at the end of the night. He also said that if Dusty promised he's going to turn it into a pumpkin, you best believe it could happen, Daddy. And I have no idea what the hell that was supposed to mean, but, well, Dusty delivered it. So you can always give him a free pass whenever he says something off the wall like that. Then we come back from the break for another great midnight segment. Got Cornette out there saying that all the footage we saw earlier was a mirage. They edited out the parts where the Midnights were on the scaffolding doing cartwheels and all kinds of athletic-looking stuff. And that next week on the show, we were going to get the full context to everything. The missing footage, shall we say. In the meantime, he turns things over to Ronnie Garvin in order to promote the upcoming match with him and Big Bubba for the Starrcade event. I believe he called it a Louisiana street fight. Even though they're not in Louisiana for Starrcade 86, but all right then. And this is just classic corny delivery with the bombshell lines here, saying Bubba brushes his teeth with a sandblaster and shaves with barbed wire. Good line. And I guess we'll see what groundbreaking footage they come up with next week to show us that the Midnights are not cowards and totally have that scaffold match under control, as we clearly found out earlier on in the program. Yeah, Bobby and Dennis, they ain't sweating that match. They're almost guaranteed victory. Then we got Rick Rude versus Paul Garner. Rude went over with the DDT, or properly termed the Rude Awakening, which then took us back to the booth for a show-closing promo with Cornette and Bubba, where in the first minute of the segment was Corny not being able to get anything out because everyone was showering him with Pumpkinhead chants. Now that I think about it, I think I figured out where that pumpkin line came from Dusty earlier. Just trying to refresh everybody's memories. Anyway, beyond that, this was every last-ditch effort from Cornette to hard sell the idea that the Midnights stand any chance in the match with the Road Warriors, doing his best to pump them up and put over Eden and Condrey. Like, we did not just see clips of them 20 minutes prior wetting their pants while standing on top of a 20-foot structure, but, well, that's the greatness of pro wrestling, because heels lie, and they over-exaggerate. He also drew the analogy that after the Road Warriors fall off the scaffolding through the concrete, they'll create a big enough hole to bury an elephant. Because that's exactly what Hawk and Animal are. Two big bumbling elephants. So yeah, that was a very Cornette-centric program. Kind of miss those theme shows because looking back, those usually end up being the better studio programs. That 3-minute tape of the scaffold segment with the Midnights is worth the watch of the show alone. I don't know if there are any clips of it on YouTube somewhere, but I hope there is, because I highly encourage anybody out there that's never seen it, go out of your way to try to track those videos down. An all-timer right there. The rest of the show was kind of there again. You know, the effective Starrcade build is always there, but the 30-minute shows just usually doesn't give a whole lot to report on. Like I said, they're doing effective card build, but, you know, the squashes are total throwaways. Mainly everything that we're basing the shows on are the promo material. And there were some good ones on this show, but pretty much all centered around the scaffold match. That sort of got the main focus out of everything else. One that I am very much looking forward to reviewing in a couple weeks, because it is a classic. All right. Hopefully I'll edit that cut out of there. Had to refill my water glass. Also highly convenient. I walk by the window and it is snowing. Because that's what happens in Pittsburgh. In November, apparently. Don't recall the winter season kicking in this early on, but if anything, it'll be a precursor to what I'm in store for come January. Anyhow, if you live in Florida, God bless you. I wish I could move there. So, World Class Championship Wrestling. This would be November 19th, 1983. And we are edging closer to Star Wars. And after last week's show, we kind of facilitated a couple of the featured matches for that program. The signing of Chris Adams and Jimmy Garvin for the American Heavyweight title, now that Sunshine has officially turned babyface. We also had the announcement for the Loser Leaves Town match between Kerry Von Erich and Michael Hayes of the Freebirds. So those are signed, sealed, and delivered. For this show, it was pretty standard. Didn't really have a whole lot going on outside the main event, which was mostly just a way to whet people's appetites for the Adams-Garvin title match in a few weeks. We began with an encore presentation of a David Von Erich versus Kamala match. And this one kind of stems from that TV match they aired a couple weeks ago in Fort Worth, where Kamala kept refusing to get in the ring with David after he had the claw put on him. Remember, I think that was the one where literally half the match was Kamala stalling on the floor. So finally, they air the match where they're going one-on-one, and the finish sees David get the win over Kamala with the claw, only because Friday had thrown in the towel as a form of surrender on behalf of Kamala, which the General Skandar Akbar did not take too kindly to. So he proceeds to start whipping Friday like a dog, to coin a great quote from David Crockett. And at the point David tried to intervene and tell Akbar to go piss up a rope sideways, Akbar proceeds to wind up, and he gives David a whip shot directly across the back of the head and neck, at which point my insides began to churn, because I was deathly afraid that David was going to actually shoot on Akbar and beat the shit out of him for how hard that blow looked. And then, of course, Kamala just got the jump on David anyway. Finally, the whole thing culminates with Kerry running out to save his brother, while Mike Von Erich is restrained by some of the boys. Apparently because they were not going to let a rookie go in there to get his ass beaten from pillar to post, which is actually a pretty sound strategy if you're a babyface looking out for the best interest of your colleagues. Probably wouldn't want to let a green rookie go out there and try to do a stand-up with the most dangerous heel on the roster. So that was a pretty cool little segment. Again, that one looked like it was shot in Fort Worth as opposed to Dallas. I can't remember if they said who Mike Von Erich was wrestling at the Star Wars show, but given his engagement with the Devastation Incorporated here, I presume it'd be someone from the group, whoever's left. I think we talked about last week how the Mongol had left the territory by this point, so they're kind of going through a series of changes, but hopefully it's not Kamala, because good Lord, that would be suicide. So after that, we had a quick little video pre-tape to build up the Kerry Von Erich Michael Hayes match for the Star Wars event. Thanksgiving Star Wars, by the way, not Christmas. I think I kept saying last week it was the Christmas Star Wars event. But no, there is a Thanksgiving edition first, and then the regular Christmas event at the end of the year. But for this segment, in addition to the Loser Leaves Town stip, it is also going to be held inside a cage. Very apropos for how this whole thing began just 1 year ago in December, when Hayes first turned on Kerry in the cage to begin with. So they gave promo time to both guys here. Kerry's was relatively dull and uninspiring, just vowing that he would send Michael back to Georgia after it's all said and done. Hayes at least had a little bit of fire here, saying that he's sick of the Von Erichs, and that even if Kerry had some luck inside the cage with Ric Flair, the fact is, Jack, Kerry ain't dealing with no Ric Flair. He's dealing with the man born on Bad Street, USA. And if Hayes is leaving, he's leaving under his own terms. He also claimed to hate Texas, which makes the whole thing that much greater. The fact that his hatred for the Von Erichs runs so deep, he'd rather stay in Texas and have to deal with all these redneck geeks than have to see Kerry show his face in world class for an entire year. That, my friend, is what we call true heat. So after that, we had a Jose Lothario Tonga John match. A match that felt like it went on for an eternity. And by the time it was over, I realized that I wrote down virtually nothing about the actual match. If you have seen any paint by numbers wrestling match in your entire life in the territories, it's pretty much this match in a nutshell. Lothario controlled everything early on, got cut off for the heat. Tonga John ended up missing a diving headbutt off the middle rope. Lothario milked a small comeback toward the end. Actually gave Tonga some stiff-looking shots to the jaw that sounded like gunfire. And at the end, Lothario hit a big seated splash from the top rope for the pin. Like I said, by the time it was over, I realized that I wrote down almost nothing about the match. Not because I wasn't actively paying attention, just really didn't have anything to say about it. And then we went into Super Destroyer number 1 versus the Iceman King Parsons. And I believe we noted last week that Super Destroyer number 2 was Bill Irwin under the mask, which would mean that Super Destroyer 1 was Scott Irwin, his brother. Not that you could ever figure that out when they had the exact same masks and ring gear on. It was a pretty fun match, though. Leave it to the real pros back in the day that knew how to garner heat just by using an illegal closed fist. The amount of people that used to admonish the heels for using cheap offensive tactics during their matches. It'll blow your mind sometimes. Now, of course, that's back when the people weren't smart, but still. The people were super into the Iceman, though, as per usual. And that actually kind of worked perfectly with the dynamics of the characters here. You know, we mentioned last week how the Super Ds were just debuting on that very show. So they obviously wanted to establish them out of the gate as being serious players in Ogbar's group. And that's kind of how they laid out the match here. Super D2 took about 80% of the action. Iceman sold and worked from underneath. Ended up making his valiant comeback at the end. And finally, just when the Iceman was about to secure the win, obviously you figured that the identical mask gimmick for the Super Ds was going to play into the finish eventually. So right when Parsons hit Super D with the butt, Super D number 2 pulls him out of the ring behind the ref's back, and they do the old switcheroo twin magic gimmick. And, I mean, you've seen that story play out in wrestling so many times over the years. It's not really a new idea. But, you know, Iceman doesn't see it, so he picks up Super D, And then the other Super D cradles him and pins him. And of course, Parsons is all frazzled and confused after the fact. It's the oldest trick in the playbook. So we'll see how that one factors into the Star Wars show in a few. And I think at that point, yep, that was our main event for the show. A tag bout featuring Chris Adams and Johnny Mantell going up against Jim Garvin and Baldy Roberts. First, we had Garvin in ringside with Bill Mercer to introduce us to his main squeeze. Now, obviously, we know her better as Precious, but it is important to keep in mind that up until this point, they've never mentioned her name in any capacity on the show. She's been mystery valet for Jimmy Garvin, aka Sunshine's assistant, which we all know wasn't meant to last. And he still did not outright refer to her as Precious here, but he called her the real Sunshine. Well, that other sorry excuse for a valet hit the bricks, never to be seen again. And they're both very confident that she will never be back on Dallas TV ever again. She's gone forever. Absolutely zero chance of that woman getting involved in any capacity on that show ever again. So the match. Well, I'll tell you for certain who was over in this segment. You want to take a wild guess? Sunshine. The real one, not the bootleg cosplay. She even has a fan section now in the Dallas crowd, which I can't tell if I'm supposed to interpret that as cute or creepy, especially when the individuals cheering for Sunshine look like they ought to be registered offenders. In any case, the wrestling here was a lot of fun. Adams Mantell were great flashy baby faces. Buddy and Jimmy fed and sold great for all their offense. Pretty much any time the heels were in control, the Sunshine chants would start erupting. And that led to Garvin getting distracted at various points. And they worked over Mantell until the double bonk spot with Garvin and Adams. Or I'm sorry, with Mantell and Garvin, so Adams could get the hot tag. And Adams got a little bit of revenge on Garvin here, but not too much where it overstayed its welcome, because you got to sell the title match. But the real highlight of this whole thing came at the very end, when Sunshine runs out through the crowd, and she starts making chase for Precious. And she chases her into the ring and rips her coat off. Crowd blew a fucking gasket when she showed up, too. I mean, like I said, she was the most over thing in this entire segment, and she literally didn't show up until the last 10 seconds of it. And then after Precious took off running for the hills, Sunshine returned the favor to Garvin by blinding him with her hairspray. And poor Sunshine, she's trying to leave through the aisleway, and she's got half the goddamn building trying to either reach out to grab her for autographs or high fives. She didn't look comfortable. We'll just leave it at that. I don't even think Sunshine expected that she would get that kind of fan reception once she finally split from Garvin. Part of me wonders if she ended up regretting it. Now knowing she was going to have all those fans constantly begging for her autographs at ringside. Can get overwhelming, having all those people surround you like that. The fame and the fortune. It'll do numbers on you. But this week she had her sights set on one thing. To get a little bit of redemption on those no-good SOBs for humiliating her on television last week. And, well, I think she executed it well. Really good stuff. And then following up on her press conference from last week, where Sunshine informed everybody that she personally gave Chris Adams all of Garvin's tapes and medical records. Now we know that Chris Adams has watched those tapes, and he knows Garvin's weakness. He's not going to reveal it, but he's got it hanging in the back of his mind so that when the time comes, he can use it to his advantage. As for Sunshine, she has some further involvement in that upcoming American Heavyweight title match of the Star Wars event. But we'll have to wait and see what her involvement is going to be. As if anybody couldn't already figure it out. But, just kind of put a cap on everything here. We had David Manning coming afterwards to recap everything that is going on with the 2 featured matches for the Star Wars event. Really didn't have a whole lot to say about it, but made you realize something. You know, that David Manning could actually cut a hell of a promo. Weren't too many officials around that could cut a convincing promo back in the day, but David Manning was one of them. He could talk. So, well, there you have it. Pretty solid little show. Probably not as impactful as last week, but the main event was a highlight. And with the Thanksgiving and Christmas Star Wars shows in relatively close proximity, I think I instinctually kept referring to everything as a Christmas Star Wars special, but they're setting up the Thanksgiving one first. And then we will see how everything culminates at the end of the year. But it's a lot of big happenings with world-class television right now. Anyway, well, we'll see what happens this Saturday. I'm not optimistic, let's just put it that way. Considering the state of pro wrestling in 2022, I honestly don't know how anybody can be optimistic if you actually value your time. I'll tell you this, I'm purely watching to see MJF win the world title. Anything else that happens on that show is just placeholder for me. Hopefully the main event is enough to make up for what'll probably end up being a lousy to mid pay-per-view showing, which is not out of the ordinary for AEW in most cases. Usually a couple good things, but on the whole, bleh. So we'll see. Until then, take care all. We'll be back Monday for the Big Full Gear recap, along with the Retro Raw and SmackDown reports. So, take care. Peace.